I never thought I'd be introducing virtual reality as the latest addition to our marriage, but that's exactly what happened. I'm Tom, 58 years old, married to Linda for close to 35 years. We've been through everything together, raising our 2 kids, building a life, paying off the house. Now, with retirement looming, it seemed like a good time to invest in something exciting, something that could bring us even closer. So when I came across a deal on a top-of-the-line VR system, I couldn't resist. Linda and I have always found comfort in our routines. We both work hard, and most evenings are a predictable mix of TV reruns and dinners at our small kitchen table. But lately we've been feeling, well, a bit adrift. After decades of focusing on kids, careers, and making ends meet, this newfound quiet left us wondering what to do next. So the VR system was my attempt to add some excitement to our lives. Linda laughed when I brought it home, the kind of surprised laughter I hadn't seen in a while. "You're serious about this?" she asked, arching an eyebrow as she inspected the headset. "Why not?" I replied, grinning. "Who says you can't teach old dogs new tricks?" The first time we put the headsets on, we looked absolutely ridiculous. Linda waving her hands in front of her, trying to figure out how to grab a virtual object, and me stumbling around like a toddler just learning to walk. But even with our fumbling, we were both smiling, immersed in this strange new world. It was as though we were breaking down some invisible wall, something that had kept us from experiencing life together in a different way. The next few evenings were exciting. We'd try out different experiences, from exploring underwater worlds to launching into outer space. For the first time in a long while, it felt like we were discovering something together again. Our VR experiences became our nightly ritual, our little adventure, just the 2 of us. Linda seemed lighter, happier, as though something in her was awakening that had been dormant for too long. And then things shifted. It happened gradually, barely noticeable at first. Linda started spending more time on her own in the VR world. Instead of exploring together, she was putting the headset on right after dinner and disappearing into virtual realms without even inviting me to join. I brushed it off initially, even finding it charming. She was, after all, someone who threw herself completely into whatever she did. "Tom, this thing is amazing," she'd say, excitedly sharing stories about places she'd been or the people she'd met. At first, I was proud that she was embracing something new, that she was stepping out of her comfort zone and enjoying herself. But as days passed, I found myself feeling unnecessary, uninvited. It was strange, seeing her so captivated by something that didn't involve me at all. She'd laugh while wearing the headset, a lighthearted, joyous sound, and I'd catch myself feeling a pang of something I hadn't felt in a long time: jealousy. It's difficult to explain. Linda was right there beside me, yet it felt like she was miles away. This enthusiasm, this spark she suddenly had, was something I hadn't seen in years, but it wasn't for me. She wasn't laughing at a joke I'd made, or smiling, because we were having a wonderful time together. She was immersed in a world that I wasn't a part of, one that was slowly stealing her away. And so, night after night, I'd watch her from the other end of the couch, her face a mix of concentration and joy as she navigated the VR world, her laughter filling the room while I sat, detached. I didn't know it then, but that laughter, that light in her eyes, it was just the beginning of something far more complex than I ever could have imagined. In those first few weeks, I chalked up Linda's excitement to the novelty of the whole VR experience. Who wouldn't be curious, after all? The thing was incredible. The worlds felt real, the experiences rich, almost tangible. But what began as a shared adventure soon felt like I was standing on the outside, watching her walk further into a world where I had no place. It started with small things. She'd put the headset on earlier and stay in longer, even after I'd already taken mine off. Sometimes she'd still be in the VR world when I headed up to bed, laughing or nodding as she interacted with something, or someone I couldn't see. I'd watch her as I went up the stairs, thinking she'd finish up soon and join me. Instead, more often than not, I'd wake up hours later to find her finally coming to bed, a distant look in her eyes. When I asked her about it, she'd be vague. "Oh, just exploring," she'd say, waving off my questions with a slight smile. I was talking to a couple of folks about the mountainside hike I took last night. It's supposed to feel like a real trek, you know? Her words sounded harmless enough, but there was an undercurrent, something intangible that made me feel out of place, like I was intruding. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way she said them, like she was keeping something to herself, something she didn't want me to know. The changes extended beyond her VR time. She started skipping family dinners and get-togethers, events she would have usually looked forward to. I'd tell her about an invitation, and she'd shrug, glancing away. "I'm a bit tired," she'd say, or "maybe next time. You go on without me." Once I suggested we have a quiet weekend away, a little trip up the coast, just the two of us. She declined, saying she didn't want to disconnect from the community she'd been building in VR. "They count on me to be there, you know," she said, almost wistfully. I didn't understand it. Since when did my wife have an entire community of strangers she felt so loyal to? I'd never seen her act this way with social media or any other hobby. Linda had always been more reserved, more grounded. But VR was different. She wasn't just observing or browsing. She was living another life. That's when I began to feel small, diminished. I'd wanted us to try this VR thing together, to have a shared experience that would bring us closer, yet it was driving a wedge between us. She was pulling away from me, and I couldn't stop her. I felt her slipping, day by day, into a place where I couldn't follow, no matter how close I sat beside her. One night, sitting in our living room, I suggested, "Why don't we try something together again? We could check out that virtual art gallery you told me about." She hesitated, her expression flickering. "Maybe later. I've got some people waiting for me. We have a session lined up?" Actually, I didn't ask what kind of session she meant, but the way she said it, with that slight smile, felt too intimate for comfort. She slipped on the headset, and just like that, she was gone again. The evenings I spent alone multiplied. She'd disappear into the headset after dinner, and I'd be left with the house to myself. I found myself checking the time, trying to guess how late she'd stay in VR. The familiar sounds of our shared home were interrupted only by the occasional laugh from her, a sound I used to treasure. Now, it felt like a reminder of the world she preferred to mine. Friends started noticing her absence, too. When asked why she wasn't around, I found myself making excuses I didn't fully believe. "She's just got a new hobby," I'd say, brushing it off with a forced smile, trying not to reveal the growing ache in my chest. But with each passing day, that ache became harder to ignore. There was a distance forming between us, one I couldn't bridge, and I had no idea how to handle it. The VR world was just supposed to be an adventure, a distraction, a bit of harmless fun. So, why did it feel like it was taking my wife away? She was just one room away, yet she might as well have been in another country or another life. For the first time in all our years together, I found myself wondering if I was losing her, and if there was anything I could do to stop it. As the days passed, I started to feel like a guest in my own home. Linda was now spending every free hour in VR, diving into whatever it was that kept her laughing, smiling, and glowing with a new kind of energy. It was strange to watch her come alive like that, only to find she was somewhere I couldn't follow. I wanted to know why. I wanted to understand what had captured her so completely. One evening, Linda left her VR headset and phone on the table, the VR app still open. Normally, I wouldn't have looked. It wasn't like me to snoop. But the curiosity gnawed at me. Maybe if I understood what was happening in her virtual world, I could find a way to bridge the gap forming between us. Scrolling through her messages, I noticed one name that appeared again and again. ShadowFox. A virtual handle? I assumed. Their messages were nothing scandalous at first glance, but the sheer volume of exchanges hinted at an intimacy that felt out of place. Some of the messages were warm, with subtle inside jokes, and others were layered with meaning. Phrases like, "Can't wait to meet you tonight," or "You always make me laugh." A pit formed in my stomach. Linda had always been reserved with others, and seeing her so open, so engaged, and with a stranger, left me feeling like I was intruding on something deeply personal. I couldn't believe she'd been hiding this connection from me. When she returned, I tried to bring it up casually. "Hey, who's ShadowFox?" I asked, hoping to sound curious rather than accusatory. She glanced at me, her smile fading slightly. "Oh, just someone I met in VR. You know, people you meet when you're exploring the worlds there. She said it casually, but there was something too casual about it, something forced. Seems like you two were getting close. I continued, trying to keep my tone light. Linda bristled slightly, crossing her arms. Tom, it's just a way to relax. VR is my escape. I thought you'd understand that by now. An escape. The word stung. I'd been hoping VR would bring us together, not that it would turn into a getaway that shut me out. In the days that followed, Linda seemed to guard her VR time more fiercely, making sure to close her apps and keep her headset nearby. I'd catch glimpses of her with the VR set on, laughing softly or talking in a low voice. The more she pulled away, the more isolated I felt, like I was becoming a stranger to her. To get a better grasp of what was going on, I decided to explore VR myself. I wanted to see if there was something I'd missed, a kind of magic I hadn't picked up on before. Maybe if I stepped into her world, I'd understand the appeal. I set up my own avatar, a generic one at first, and began wandering through the virtual landscapes we'd once explored together. But I couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness. I moved through bustling virtual plazas and quiet scenic landscapes, but without Linda beside me, the experience felt empty, even hollow. The novelty quickly wore off, and every time I saw people in pairs or groups, talking and laughing, I felt like I was on the outside looking in. Was this how she felt in our real life? Lonely and disconnected, finding comfort with strangers in a virtual world? One evening, I noticed her headset charging on the counter. Before I could think twice, I opened her VR messages again. The name ShadowFox lit up her recent messages. I scrolled through the exchanges, my heart sinking further with each line. Last night was amazing. I haven't laughed like that in ages. You looked beautiful under the VR stars tonight. A part of me wanted to believe these were harmless words exchanged between friends. But the frequency, the warmth, the open flirtation, they were all things she hadn't shared with me in ages. It felt like I was glimpsing into a part of her life that was meant to stay hidden, a life that belonged to someone else. Later that evening, I tried to talk to her about it again. Linda, I've been noticing how much time you're spending with this ShadowFox person. I started carefully, choosing my words as if I were treading over glass. Are you sure it's just fun? Just a way to relax? Her face hardened, almost immediately defensive. Tom, this is ridiculous. I don't question every single thing you do in your free time, do I? Her eyes narrowed. It's just VR, for heaven's sake. Don't turn it into something it's not. I nodded, biting back my words. But the truth was, I could already feel the distance widening with every minute she spent with ShadowFox. She went to bed that night without saying goodnight, leaving me alone with 1,000 unanswered questions. I stared at the ceiling, feeling her slipping further and further away, lost in a world I could never access. The next day, she avoided me altogether, barely meeting my eyes. There was a strange tension hanging between us, an unspoken truth that neither of us wanted to face. I tried to let it go, to tell myself that maybe this was her way of reconnecting with herself, even if it meant leaving me behind temporarily. But the truth nagged at me. Linda wasn't just hiding in VR. She was hiding with someone who was getting to see parts of her I hadn't seen in years. That night, as I watched her slip the headset back on, I felt a weight settle in my chest. It wasn't just about VR anymore. It was about our marriage, about the life we built together and the cracks that were starting to show. In the stillness, I could hear her murmuring in a low voice, laughing softly at something ShadowFox said. I felt trapped in a strange paradox. She was right here, but she was miles away, sharing moments and laughter with someone else. And in that quiet moment, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just VR anymore. It was something far deeper, something that had taken root in her heart, and I was powerless to stop it. I couldn't shake the feeling that Linda's VR sessions weren't just about games or simple escape. The more time she spent unplugged from our life, the deeper her attachment to that virtual world became. And so did my suspicions. There were days when she'd emerge from the VR headset flushed, or laughing softly to herself, as if she'd been somewhere far more exciting than our living room. The curiosity gnawed at me. I needed answers, but I didn't yet know how to get them. One evening, I decided to stay later than usual at work, figuring I'd check in on her once I got back. As I pulled up to the house, I noticed the blinds were partly open, and through a small gap, I saw her there in the living room. Linda's back was turned toward me, her head tilted as she laughed and gestured, caught up in some private joke or flirtation. She wore her VR headset, and even from outside, I could tell she was completely absorbed, her hands lifting as if she were trying to touch something or someone. I leaned forward, hoping to catch more, but the scene itself was already enough. Linda wasn't just chatting. Her body language told a different story, one of comfort, connection, and intimacy. There was something personal, maybe even romantic, about how she moved, and as I watched, I felt an unfamiliar pang in my chest. That kind of laughter was rare between us these days. But I needed something concrete before jumping to conclusions, so the next day I decided to do a little more digging. I figured I'd explore the VR world she loved so much myself. I spent most of the afternoon setting up my own profile, fumbling through the mechanics of the virtual world, which was vast and impressively detailed. After some maneuvering, I managed to locate the app she used and, to my surprise, found her avatar online. I had no idea what name she'd chosen for herself, but the app had a tracking feature to find friends nearby. And after a few minutes, I found her avatar in a secluded, dimly lit space with a panoramic view of the stars. She was seated, her head tilted, as if gazing at the artificial galaxy surrounding her. Next to her was an avatar I didn't recognize, a sleek, dark figure named ShadowFox. They were engrossed in each other, and although I couldn't make out every word, snippets of their conversation drifted through the space between us. "I wish we could meet in person, you know," I heard her say, her voice carrying a softness I hadn't heard in ages. The avatar, named ShadowFox, leaned in closer, his voice smooth and gentle, as he replied, "Sooner than you think. Just say the word, and I'll be there." My stomach twisted as I watched their closeness. The way she responded to his every word, every laugh, every little shared joke. It was as though I didn't even exist in her world anymore. And here, she was creating something real, something with emotional weight and intensity. All the things I thought she and I once shared were now happening right in front of me. Only I was on the outside, looking in. I don't know how long I stood there, my hand frozen over the exit button, feeling an odd mixture of heartbreak and disbelief. It was as if my wife had managed to disappear into a place where I'd never be able to reach her. And the worst part was, she didn't even seem to want to be found. Later that night, when she'd finished her session, I watched her close her VR set and walk around the house with a far-off look in her eyes, as though part of her were still in that digital space. I wanted to say something, to ask her about ShadowFox, to see if she would admit to any of it. But instead, I let the silence grow, watching as she drifted further into her own secret world. After that, I couldn't pretend anymore. I didn't know who I was angrier at, her for building a life in another world, or myself for not seeing it coming. The tension had become impossible to ignore. Every time Linda slipped on that VR headset, it felt like I was watching her walk right out of my life and into another world, one where I didn't belong. I spent days trying to find the right way to bring it up, to frame it so she would understand just how much it was affecting me. But every time I imagined the conversation, I knew it wouldn't go the way I wanted it to. Still, I couldn't keep it bottled up anymore. That evening, when she emerged from her session, looking exhausted but strangely happy, I finally worked up the nerve. As she walked into the kitchen, I followed her, my heartbeat thundering in my chest. "Linda, we need to talk." My voice sounded steady, even though my insides were twisting. She turned, her eyes widening for a moment before settling into a guarded expression. "About what?" she asked, her tone light, but I could see her fingers tense around her glass of water. "About this VR thing. About how you're practically living in there," I said, my voice catching on the edge of frustration. "Every evening, every weekend, you disappear, and I'm left alone. It feels like I don't have a partner anymore." She sighed, brushing past me to set her glass on the counter. "Tom, don't be dramatic. It's an escape. It's virtual reality, not reality." I shook my head. "No, Linda. It might be virtual, but it's taking up space in our real life. You spend hours in there, laughing and talking, and I hesitated, forcing myself to continue. And then there's this guy, ShadowFox. You're closer to him than you are to me. Her expression faltered, and for a moment, she looked almost guilty. But just as quickly, her face hardened. ShadowFox? Tom, he's just a friend. Someone to talk to. Someone who understands VR. I didn't think I'd need to explain that. Her defensiveness caught me off guard, but I pushed on, unwilling to let her brush it aside so easily. It's not about explaining, I replied. It's about the fact that you seem more connected to him than to me. I've seen you with him, laughing, sharing things that you don't share with me anymore. Do you even realize how lonely that makes me feel? Linda scoffed, crossing her arms. Lonely? Tom, you're blowing this way out of proportion. ShadowFox is just someone in VR. It's not real life. It doesn't mean anything. I get to be someone else for a while. Why can't you understand that? Because it doesn't feel like it's just VR anymore, Linda, I said, my voice trembling despite myself. When I see you in there with him, I don't see you the way I used to. It's like you're someone else, like you're living a whole separate life. And I can't just sit here and pretend that it doesn't hurt. She stared at me, her expression flickering between irritation and something else. Maybe shame, maybe frustration. You're making something out of nothing, she finally said, her voice low. I still love you, but I need this escape. I need something just for me. Then why does it have to be with him? I pressed. Why does this escape mean shutting me out? Linda rolled her eyes, shaking her head in exasperation. Because it's not about you, Tom. ShadowFox, he's a VR friend. That's it. He's someone who helps me unwind, who doesn't make me feel guilty for needing a break. Why can't you just let it be? I felt my stomach churn as she dismissed my concerns so casually. It's not nothing to me, Linda. It's not just some virtual fling. It's affecting us, and you don't even seem to care. Silence fell between us, thick and heavy. She looked at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw regret flash across her face. But then she straightened, her jaw set, her eyes distant. Tom, I don't know what you expect from me. I can't apologize for wanting to have something that feels exciting. Maybe you just don't get it. With that, she turned and left the room, leaving me standing there, feeling dismissed, unseen, and more alone than ever. In the quiet hours of that same night, I sat alone in my study, feeling the walls of my once steady life tremble under the weight of Linda's secrets. I stared at her VR headset lying on the table where she'd left it, feeling the pull of both fear and anger. Fear for what I might find, and anger at the lengths she had gone to hide this other life. I reached for her headset and opened the VR app on her phone, navigating through messages, friend requests, and notifications until I found the familiar username, ShadowFox. My hand tightened around the phone as I opened the message thread, and what I saw left me struggling to catch my breath. The messages between Linda and ShadowFox spanned back months, showing an intimacy I hadn't felt from her in years. They had entire conversations about their nights together in VR, details about virtual dinners, late-night talks by a virtual fire, and God, even references to sensual VR simulations they'd shared. Their messages were filled with expressions of connection and desire, like, I can't wait to see you tonight in our spot, and last night was perfect. Let's do it again. I scrolled through, unable to look away as the messages became even more personal, hints of a fantasy world I'd been shut out of entirely. In this virtual world, Linda had shared with ShadowFox moments she hadn't shared with me in years, recreating experiences I thought were ours alone. There were discussions about VR scenarios designed to simulate romantic, almost sacred moments. Let's meet by the river tomorrow and do it all over again, the way we did last night. You make me feel alive, one of her messages read. It was the imagery that hit me the hardest. They had crafted this relationship in VR down to the smallest details, moments by candlelight, simulations of intimate touches, even VR interactions that took the form of caresses and lingering eye contact through their avatars. And then I saw it, the message that left my mind reeling. I love how we don't need words to feel each other last night. It felt real, as if you were actually here, touching me. Reading that, I felt sick, my stomach twisting at the idea of Linda feeling emotionally even physically present with someone else. Linda and ShadowFox had gone so far as to build a secluded home in the VR world, a place she had decorated just for them. There were messages about their virtual nights spent together there, and a sense of permanence to their interactions that broke me in a way I hadn't felt before. "I love coming home to you here every night. Let's make tonight special again," she'd written, with a warmth that I hadn't felt from her in years. It was one thing to share a VR game, or even to chat with someone. But this was something else entirely. She had created a life with ShadowFox, one I wasn't part of, a world where she could escape me and everything we had built. I stared at the headset, this piece of technology that had promised us a new experience together, but had instead become her means of leaving me behind. I closed my eyes, trying to keep the flood of anger from spilling over. She had shared herself in ways I'd thought were sacred between us. And now that intimacy had been given to a stranger in a fantasy world. At that moment, I knew one thing for certain. Our marriage couldn't survive like this. Not with the third person that had wedged himself between us, filling the parts of Linda's life she no longer felt she could share with me. After a sleepless night, I knew there was no more room for hesitation. The years of shared memories and the life we'd built together felt fragile, threatened by a world I could never truly understand. This wasn't just an affair. It was a betrayal of every quiet moment we'd once shared, every evening spent side by side. Linda's virtual life had eclipsed our real one, leaving me as a shadow in her world. That morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her VR headset beside her, as if she was already planning to escape back into that other life. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was going to be one of the hardest conversations we'd ever have. "Linda," I began, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "We need to talk. And not about VR games or technology. I mean us." She looked up, eyes widening, and I saw a flicker of guilt there. She must have known that I'd uncovered everything. But she said nothing, her silence both defensive and defeated. "I know about ShadowFox," I continued, watching as her face drained of color. "I know what you've been doing, the time you've spent in this fantasy with him. You build another life, Linda, one that doesn't include me." Her shoulders slumped as she let out a shaky breath. "Tom, it's not like that. It was never meant to be anything real. Wasn't it?" I shot back, gesturing toward the headset, that device that had drawn her away from me day after day. "I've read the messages, Linda. I know how deep this goes, how far you've let it take you." She covered her mouth, stifling a sob, and I saw the tears start to form. It was strange. I'd waited to see some sign of regret, and now that it was here, I wasn't sure if it made me feel any better. "I didn't plan for this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "When we got the VR, it was supposed to be for us. But somewhere along the way, I just felt lost." Her words struck me, hollow and desperate. But I had to press on. I needed answers, not apologies. "Lost," I repeated, incredulity sharpening my voice. "What about the life we have? The years we've shared? How could you just step away from all of that?" She shook her head, covering her face with her hands. "I don't know, Tom. I really don't. ShadowFox made me feel alive. I don't even know who I am anymore. I started using VR to escape, and soon it just became too real." I clenched my jaw, my mind wrestling with the enormity of it all. She hadn't just cheated on me. She drifted so far into a fantasy that she was willing to put everything at risk. "Linda," I said, my voice trembling, "if you can't let go of this man, if you can't step away from ShadowFox and everything he represents, then this marriage is over. You have to choose." She looked up, eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and something else. Hesitation, maybe even defiance. "But Tom," she whispered, "ShadowFox isn't real. None of it is real. It's just a place I go to feel something, to feel wanted. Then let it go." I replied, my voice firm. "In it, Linda. Put the VR away. Come back to us." Linda sat there, gripping the edge of the table, tears streaming down her face. She nodded slowly, almost as if in a trance. "Okay," she murmured. "Okay, I'll do it. I'll let it go." "I promise, Tom." But as I looked at her, a pang of doubt settled in. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the yearning for that other life she'd created. The decision was made, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her heart remained tethered to a place far beyond our reach. For the first time, I wasn't sure if she could keep her promise. Linda tried to keep her promise. I could see her trying at first. She put the VR headset in the closet and seemed determined to distance herself from it, from him, from that other world. For a brief moment, I thought we might actually stand a chance. The woman I knew, the life we'd built, might somehow be salvageable. But it didn't take long for her to slip. In the weeks that followed, I'd catch her glancing at the closet, her fingers nervously tapping on the armrest of her chair. She became more restless, like she was constantly itching for something just out of reach. At first, she'd excuse herself with vague errands or unexplained drives, disappearing for hours. She seemed distracted and withdrawn, and the warmth she'd shown in our attempt to rebuild slowly faded. I watched her go through the motions of our life, our routine, but it was as if she wasn't really here with me. One evening, I noticed the closet door was slightly ajar, the VR headset missing. I confronted her gently, hoping that perhaps this was just a small lapse, a moment of weakness she would own up to. She looked away, her face a mask of quiet shame. It's just a check-in, she said, voice strained. I needed to tie up loose ends. Tie up loose ends? The words stung, echoing in the silence between us. I wanted to believe her, to see it as a one-time slip. But as days passed, the check-ins became longer, the excuses more frequent. She'd spend entire evenings in the headset, locked away in the guest room. I'd hear her murmuring, sometimes laughing, at intervals that cut me to the core. I watched as Linda disappeared further into a world I could never reach, leaving behind shadows in her place. Her skin grew paler, her laughter became hollow. It was as if she was straddling two realms, unable to commit fully to either. Her gaze drifted past me, her responses to my questions more and more disconnected. She'd become someone I didn't recognize, caught somewhere between the life we shared and the life she'd constructed in VR. One evening, as I sat alone at the kitchen table, I looked around at the empty space that had once felt full, vibrant. Now, it was a house filled with the echo of our love, the ghosts of what we'd been, and the fragments of the future we'd once imagined. I thought of her in that headset, talking to someone else, living moments that weren't shared with me. And I realized that I'd been holding on to someone who had long since let go of me. I waited for her to emerge, headset in hand, her eyes still dazed from whatever reality she'd been in. I met her gaze and took a steadying breath. Linda, I can't do this anymore. She looked at me, as if surprised. Tom, I'm trying to figure it out. I just need a little more time. But time was something that had run out long ago. We've lost each other, I replied quietly, feeling the weight of my words settle between us. You're half here and half somewhere else, and I can't keep waiting for the other part of you to come back. She reached out to me, but I stepped back, shaking my head. I could see in her eyes that she wasn't ready to let go of that other world, even as she held my hand in this one. And so, I packed a bag, feeling both liberated and deeply heartbroken. I walked out of the house that we'd made our own, out of the life we'd built together. As I closed the door, I knew that I was leaving behind someone who had chosen to live in a world of her own creation, a place where I could never follow. Linda was left to her choice, her new reality, a place where she was forever divided between the person she'd been and the avatar she'd become. And as for me, I walked forward, ready to reclaim a world where I could fully belong.